Okay, hello and welcome everybody to another expert interview. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Jane Gentry. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Jane is a keynote speaker, an author, a sales trainer. She has done so many things across the globe. I think you have you say you've spoken from everywhere from Canada to the Czech Republic.
Yes.
A well sought after speaker. And today I thought it would be great if Jane and I talked about sales training, but sales training and development particularly, because as we were talking a little bit before we came on air, is sales training, everybody kind of understands traditionally how sales training takes place. And traditionally it has been very much event-based and people come in and do training sessions like workshops and all of that. But as we were discussing, Jane, it's the what happens afterwards that's the part that is often overlooked.
It's learning and development, and people forget the development part. That any kind of training, whether it's online training, which has become hugely popular, or as you're saying, the kind of legacy event-based approach, is really just content delivery, John. It is not development. And it's the knee-jerk reaction of most organizations is to put their sellers through training and assume that that's going to create behavior change, and it doesn't. And I was reading a statistic recently that 50% of sales managers think if you got rid of training altogether, it wouldn't impact the performance of their sellers. And they might be right, because we have not learned yet, by and large, that it's development that changes behavior. It's not learning. It's not content delivery that changes behavior.
But that's really interesting what you just said about the sales managers, because obviously the sales managers are the linchpins here. They're the critical factor. If you are going to really drive behavior change in a sales organization, it has to be, number one, adopted by the sales manager, reinforced by the sales manager, coached by the sales manager. Yeah. So I know you've been doing this very successfully for a long time. So how do you get to that point where the sales manager feels ownership?
That's what I was just going to say to you. They have to own it. The first thing I do is I throw statistics at them. Performance increases 63% when they are engaged. And then I define to them, what does engaged look like? And engaged means you own that content. You know that sales process well enough to teach it. You know the content, the learning content well enough to teach it. You have a strategy for coaching, and you have to own the development piece. There's just no way around that. I think companies do managers and sellers a real disservice by not telling managers that is their first responsibility, is to be a developer of salespeople, not to be a manager of the numbers. The numbers come from the right behavior, right? So if we're reinforcing the right behavior, the numbers will come. And yet most managers are, chasing those numbers every day. They're not doing what I think is their main role, and that is development.
Yeah. So how do you get them comfortable? Because one of the things that I always observed is that the sales manager is already often relatively uncomfortable in the position that they're in. And then when you bring them in when you're doing a training engagement or you're trying to do behavior change, they're doubly uncomfortable because they don't really feel like they're experts themselves. So they just default to where they're good at, and they kind of push it to the side or look at it as, oh, well, this is the initiative du jour. If I ignore it, it'll go away. How do you get them comfortable enough to be the drivers?
So I think people don't even realize how important what you just said is, John. We're doing a lot of research right now around, just to get off topic for one second, relational intelligence. It's a huge gap for millennials, and it's really going to affect sales organizations. And one of the statistics, and I'm not going to have the number correct right off the top of my head, but one of the statistics is about just what you said. How uncomfortable managers are even at speaking to the people that report to them. And so what that says to me is we're really weak in manager development inside our organizations. We don't really realize that person that interacts with those salespeople day to day is the It's the thing that's going to make you win or lose as a sales organization. And yet we promote sellers who are great, who don't necessarily have managerial skills, or we throw people in there that are very mediocre as managers, or we put financial people in that role who are the number chasers and not the people developers. So in some sense, we're doing it to ourselves, really, as organizations. We are putting people in these roles that are not equipped to do what you and I are suggesting to them is their main responsibility.
So I guess then that's a key point. Then, if you are then going to invest in a sales training and development initiative, if you haven't invested first in manager development and sales manager development, in some ways, you're kind of wasting your time and effort here and money, right?
Exactly. Yeah, we have too many managers that just aren't equipped to do it. And the other thing is that learning is changing. And one of the things that I've noticed is a lot of these MOOCs and all of this online learning is becoming really popular. But at the end of the day, John, they're just kind of doing the same thing they were doing with event-based training. They're just doing it online, right? And so the smart organizations are looking at sales development as kind of a well-rounded development process. And so we're still doing that delivery, right? Delivery of content, regardless of how you do it. But the smart organizations are investing a lot of time in their managers and holding them accountable to the right kinds of things. They're also looking at learning communities. They're thinking about what are the where is the learning in our organization, and how can we get the people that are great at these things to be part of a community of coaches for people that are up and coming or that are weaker in some of these behaviors. And so smarter companies are thinking not just the way that I might learn as an individual, which might be self-directed in an online program like a MOOC, right?
Sure.
Or with a coach or a mentor, but also what are we going to do with these with these other ways of getting people to learn in groups, like these communities of learning, and getting them to be challenged as salespeople? If you do the research on managers or leaders, what you find is that not a single person tells you that they became as great as they are today because of training. Nobody tells you that, right? So the first thing that they tell you is that it was the challenges that they experienced in their career that helped them to be better or to help them learn. And the second thing that they'll tell you is they learned from coaches or mentors or other people. So we've got to get these sellers in front of well-equipped people, because it's not training. It's not training. It's not training. I don't know how many more times to say that. It's not training that is going to change their behavior.
Yeah. No, I really like that concept that you're talking about, the concept of community and peer. Mentors and coaches, yes, but also peer learning. I do think it's one of the things that we overlook a lot in organizations is how much people can learn from each other, right? And how much that when you bring a group of people together, say you bring a group of salespeople together, sometimes, there are so many things that each of them individually do well or have good ideas that some of the others don't, and vice versa. And that we often miss the opportunity to unlock that and to have everybody kind of all the boats rise. There's
so much knowledge inside an organization that doesn't get tapped into. And some of the, what I call them higher evolved learning platforms or kind of technologies that are coming out for content delivery are really being smart about creating these communities of learning, even in that online forum, so that people are sharing with each other. This is what helped me to do this better, or I'm really challenged here. Is there anybody who's really great at this?
Right.
So they're even putting that opportunity to create community into that technology, which I think is helpful, because as you get these millennials into the workforce, that's their comfort zone, right? And they're very comfortable creating communities online. So in a sense, in my mind, we're really kind of having to create a balance between giving them this opportunity, like using the technology that they're comfortable with, while at the same time realizing that what's coming down the pike is a bunch of sellers that are not going to have relational intelligence.
Right.
For example, the ability of college students to empathize has dropped 40% since 2000. And that number is staggering to me. I don't know how you sell if you're not able to put yourselves in the shoes of your customers, right? If you can't empathize with the needs of your customers. So these are some of the challenges that we're going to be facing in learning and development and trying to train our sellers moving forward. So we're going to have to create a balance, and I think move a lot more towards this idea of creating communities of learning and really, really empowering managers and being smart about what we're asking them to do and how we prepare them to do their job.
Well, I want to go back to that piece that you just referenced, because I think it's a little startling in many ways, as you said, about the empathy piece that, people coming out of college without it, because obviously, empathy is a tough thing to teach people, right?
Yeah.
So number one, let me ask you, why is it that they're coming out with less empathy, and how do you address it given the fact that empathy is a hard thing to train?
Yeah. Why is it happening? I mean, the research shows very clearly that it's happening because they've been brought up on technology. When we create these really great developments in society, we never really plan out what's going to happen or how it's going to impact society. We're just going to launch it into the world with no thinking, right? And right now, we're starting to suffer the effects of tossing all this great technology out into the world and not really holding young people accountable to being able to talk face to face like you and I are. They're not comfortable doing that, right? And so think about how bullying has increased and other kinds of things, because it's so much easier to be nasty to somebody in an email or a text than it is to look them right in the eyeball and say something nasty to them. So I think that empathy, and you're right, it is staggering. It's a scary number. That's a direct correlation to the technology and their ability. We're actually creating, this generation coming up has more anxiety than any generation in the history that we've measured in the world, right? Even the World War I generation, we have got more anxious kids now than even people during the time of World War I. Wow. So that's the why, I think. And it's pretty easy to draw those, connect those dots, right? The how is pretty interesting. And you're right. I can't teach you empathy to actually care about how I feel, John.
Right.
But I can teach you what we call cognitive empathy. I can teach you how to recognize the signs and signals that I'm giving off that indicate how I feel, how I'm feeling about our interaction, or how I'm feeling about what you're saying. And I can teach you how to react appropriately.
Right.
But it stops there. I can't teach you to care about it, right? So there are ways, believe it or not, to get somebody to that cognitive place that they're recognizing the signs and behaving appropriately. But that's about as far as we can go in terms of teaching empathy. And there's so many, and we're off topic a little bit.
Sure, but it's important.
I mean, these are issues that are going to come up for learning and development professionals. Some of the other drivers of relational intelligence, and we're only really looking, if you think about relational intelligence, I mean, we could do a year of learning on relational intelligence. What we really care about is, what are the gaps specific to young sellers and young employees, right? So communication is a huge part of relational intelligence, but not all communication is really going to be a problem. But what is conflict management, right? Having hard conversations, direct correlation to the anxiety that I just told you about, situational awareness, just being aware of what's going on around you and reading the signs and signals that are happening, understanding how to react in different environments. It's a huge gap for this Gen Z and that younger generation. We talked about empathy and what I call the rules of engagement.
Right.
In other words, they get it. I'll give you an example that I use in my keynotes about this topic. You may or may not remember that there was a young girl a year or two ago who worked for Yelp. No, I'm going to get the company wrong. I feel like it was Yelp, but I might have it wrong.
Okay.
She was really dissatisfied with her job or her pay or whatever, and she decided that the right way to handle that was to write a fairly nasty open letter to the CEO of the company and post it online, and it went viral. And I actually show, some of that letter to the audience, and it's pretty, not a way that I would ever talk to somebody that was the CEO of my company, certainly, right? And she got fired. Now, you and I probably aren't surprised by that.
Sure.
She was completely caught off guard by that and had no idea why that was inappropriate or why she got fired. And that's one example of kind of a common situation where they don't really understand the rules of engagement. And it shows up in things like that. Or I get to the job and in 6 months, I expect to be promoted into vice president and these kinds of things. And so that's going to be another one of those situations. And the other one that comes to mind is context.
Right.
And the media doesn't help with this, right?
Sure.
Because we take such a shortcut in the way we communicate on text, we don't have the patience to go through the long process that you and I are going through to have a conversation, get to know things, right? We've shortened so many things that they aren't good at putting things in context. And of course, when I say something like they are, I don't mean to generalize.
Sure.
There are highly evolved millennials and highly evolved Gen Yers. But statistically, it is a big gap, and it is happening now, and it is right around the corner for learning and development professionals, and it's going to impact sales professionals dramatically.
Oh, I think it's going to impact sales absolutely dramatically, like you correctly say, because if you think about it, right, a buying process, let's take it from the buyer point of view, right? I often say, like, in a B2C buying environment, right, if I'm a consumer and I make a bad purchase, well, it's really down on me and maybe it upsets my wife or whatever. But the ramifications are fairly limited, right? They're contained. In a B2B situation, if I'm the main person making a buying decision, it can have a huge impact on my career, right? It can be career enhancing if I make the right decision and we roll it out and it's all fantastic, or I make the wrong buying decision. It turns out it doesn't work. I didn't do my research properly. It can be career limiting. So there's a huge amount of emotion wrapped up in it, right? So if you as a seller, and I think this is part of what you're talking about here, that trying to train and develop sellers for that empathy to really understand that this is a big deal for the people involved in the purchasing decision. So I see a huge challenge for people in training and development as they try to get people to understand that putting yourself in the buyer's shoes is not just understanding what their business issues are, but understanding what is the impact on them personally.
Exactly. And keep in mind that whole concept of the buying process and understanding the buying process is relatively new. So this isn't something we've been doing for 20 years. And we're just starting to bring these young people into understanding this. This is fairly new in terms of the way that we think about sales process and integrating it to the buying process. Seems like something we should have learned a long time ago, right? I find that we're very slow on the upkeep a lot of times, right? On the uptake.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but I agree with you. I think you're absolutely right. And what I end up hearing in organizations and more is, can you fix the millennials? And the truth is, they're not broken.
Right, right. They're just different.
And they're not entirely bad, and they're not entirely wrong. They frankly just grew up in a different environment than we did. And ultimately, selling will not be the way that millennials think it's going to be, but it will also not be the way that it is now.
Right.
So the opportunity for us as learning and development professionals is to be part of that conversation and be part of how we move things in the right way in the future. I think it's an opportunity. I think people look at it the wrong way, right?
So where are some examples maybe where you have seen really good training and development initiatives in organizations that get it from a holistic point of view?
They're few and far between, I'll be honest with you. I actually was in the fall, I was working with one of the biggest brands in the world. And because I'm not going to tell a good story about them, I'm not going to say their name. And they said, we have a new sales initiative that we want you to help us with. And I said, great, what is it? He said, we're calling it Customer Back. Okay, can you tell me a little bit more about that? Jane, we're going to go to the customer. We're going to ask what their objectives are and their goals and what's holding them back from meeting those objectives. Then we're going to come back and we're going to craft our solution around those things. John, we've been doing that for 20 years. Yeah. This is one of the biggest brands in the world.
And they made this discovery all of a sudden?
Yeah, like it was revolutionary. And I said to them, what were you doing? And they said, well, we're XYZ company. We just went in and said, how much do you want? And so what it takes is for somebody to get their butt kicked in the market, for them to realize why you should be training and developing your sellers. And the other thing that I think is important for us to know as we think about our sales organization. So think of this company, and they said, we're going to do this Customer Back initiative, right? And I said to them, and it was for their key customers, their biggest customers. I said, will you put in front of me, please, your account planning process, your customer review process, and there was a third one I can't remember. And we spread them on the table, and I said, now I want you to look at these and tell me who these are about. And it took about 45 seconds, for them to say these are about us. And I said, so the question is, do you think that you're going to get customer back behavior by putting your sellers in ABC company back processes? And it's like this light bulb went off for them. And I find that, unfortunately, more than I find companies that are really getting it. Right? And it's disheartening, actually. Now, I will tell you, there is a new learning technology that has come out that really gets it and does the things that you and I are talking about. And I don't mean to pitch a particular product, but there's a platform called Jubi, Jubi. I think it's short for Jubilant.
Right.
And the man that developed it, Larry Moll, was Chief Learning Officer for Motorola and American Express. And so these concepts that you and I are talking about, he's been challenged with that for his whole career, right, as a Chief Learning Officer. So this idea of delivering content really is just that. But how do we get people off of the platform, away from the computer, doing the behavior, right? Being coached on the behavior, having learning communities online, and creating an inspirational learning environment by using gamification and some of those other things that are really popular, right? To really be developing people, not just spewing content at them. So I think some of those things are exciting. And when you get to combine some of those things with some legacy kind of event-based things and some good coaching, I think we really can see some changes moving forward. But sales managers and learning professionals really have to start looking at learning and development differently than I think they have in the past. And not to beat a horse into the ground, but it starts with managers.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree.
I said to you before we started, I wanted to write an article that said sales training doesn't suck, managers suck. And I thought, well, that's a little controversial. I'm not sure how many people would do that. But at the end of the day, that's really what's holding us back.
Yeah, I know, I totally agree with you. And part of the fault is, obviously it is with executive management and leadership, and the fact that we haven't always defined what the responsibilities of the sales manager are. And let's face it, when when it comes to the end of the month or the end of the quarter, whatever, where do we focus? We're focused
Right.
100% on the numbers, and then the
Right.
beginning of the next month, we're focused on the forecast. And
Right.
we don't very often say to the manager, well, actually, let's stop for a moment, time out. Let's talk about what are you doing to develop your salespeople?
Yeah. So I start to ask questions like, how soon do you jump into the sales process to coach?
Mm-hmm.
Majority of managers jump in right at the end of the sale, right?
Absolutely.
As opposed
I always
to
call them
at
the
the very
parachuting
beginning,
in.
which is when they should. Are we agreed on that?
100%.
Yes. The other thing is I say to them, you need to coach to the behavior that you want. If you coach to the behavior, those are really your key performance indicators, if you think about it, right?
Yeah.
What are the behaviors that if we do these behaviors, we win more than we lose? That's what you should be coaching to.
Yeah.
And those things are measurable. You know, numbers are too far out of something to think about for a salesperson. You know, that number is just this target that I'm reaching for. But, you know, the behaviors, that's something I can coach all the way through the process.
Yeah, and that's something, as you say, you can measure as a leading indicator of success. Numbers are lagging indicators, right? They're looking backwards and there's nothing you can do about them. And the reality is there's a lot of variables that come into play about whether you win business or not.
Yep.
So if you actually, as you correctly say, if you measure the behavior and look at the behaviors, then you can say executing these behaviors correlate with more success than when you don't execute these behaviors.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. The other gap I find more than not, which is kind of discouraging, is that I don't think there doesn't seem to be in a lot of organizations a great matchup between the process and the learning.
Right.
In other words, I want you to look at the process and I want you to say, what do we need to train to achieve this process? And yet people just pick a methodology, a sales methodology, or some training class that's really popular. And, I think they need to learn negotiation. I think they need to learn great questions, but they don't really connect it in an integral way with the sales process. And I think that's a big mistake that we make.
I totally agree with you, because I don't think most people do enough analysis of their sales process. It's one of the reasons why at Pipeliner we built in an archive feature in our CRM so that you could actually see the sales process of deals that you lost. Right. So you could go back and look, and then maybe look at it from a team point of view and an individual point of view and say, oh, look, collectively, we seem to be weak in this part. Right.
Yeah.
Individually, people are weak in these parts, but collectively, they're weak. So we've got to look at the sales process for that. And I just don't think enough companies do enough analysis of the sales process. And that's why they don't train to it, because they develop a sales process and they say, cool, we have a sales process, and we don't have to worry about that for the next 3 or 4 years.
Box checked.
Yeah, box checked, even though sales processes are dynamic, because customers are dynamic, right? And buyers are dynamic. So yeah, I agree with you. They don't train to it because it's a box check.
Yeah, and there's not a one-size-fits-all to L&D. You really need to be paying attention to who your learners are. And I find that the proportion of the way that you coach them and train them needs to change. So, for example, your high performers, I would spend 25% or 20% of their time in any kind of training and 80% of their time in deal coaching and mentoring of those people. Whereas your low performers, I would do the exact opposite.
Right.
I'd spend 20% of the time coaching and 80% of the time doing skill development, because if they're not going to get it, then they need to get cut and move along. But the biggest opportunity is that middle group, you know? And how are we thinking percentage-wise about what we're doing to teach that middle group? Because those are the ones that we can influence the most, right?
Yeah, and that's the one where if you move their skill a couple of percentage points up,
tiny bit,
you get an exponential increase in revenue, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Well, listen, we're bumping up against time. This has been fascinating. I mean, we could talk. I mean, there's about 5 subjects that we could actually go off on tangents now.
I could talk all day.
Yeah, and we will come. And I hope you'll come back, because I'd like to dig more into the relational stuff you talked about earlier and that research. But what I'd like you to do now is just tell the viewers a little bit more about yourself and how they can connect and contact you.
Okay, thank you for that. Our company is Jane Gentry and Company. The website is www.janegentry.com. Pretty simple. Twitter is @JaneGentry. Trying to make, you see a trend here?
Yeah.
I see a pattern. Ready? My LinkedIn profile is Jane M. Gentry. Evidently, there was a Jane Gentry that beat me to the punch on that one. But our company is a consultancy that helps companies sell more. So if that means sales process, learning and development, pulling those things together, leadership, manager coaching, whatever it takes to help you sell more, that's what we do.
Well, listen, thanks again, Jane. This has been fantastic. My name is John Golden from SalesPOP Online Sales Magazine and Pipeliner CRM. We'll see you again for another expert chat. And again, I'd like to thank Jane. This has been a fascinating conversation today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.